What if everything you thought you knew about sex, desire, and self-worth wasn't quite the whole story? This is The Reveal, a podcast about what happens when we ask better questions about the most intimate parts of being human. I'm Elle, certified sexologist and life coach. And every week I invite therapists, sexual health experts, wellness leaders, and cultural thinkers to help us explore the layered and often overlooked space where sexuality, identity, and emotional truth meet. These are conversations about how we heal, how we connect, and how we find real joy and relief in a world that doesn't always make either easy. Curious? So am I. This is The Reveal. Oh, and just a heads up, sometimes when I forget a word mid-sentence, I jokingly substitute it with the word vagina, even if it doesn't make sense. It's a habit, but honestly, it makes me laugh, and hopefully you too. Today, we're diving into a conversation that asks us to reconsider everything we've been taught about women's bodies, pain, and pleasure. For centuries, women's pain has been dismissed, normalized, or even romanticized, from menstrual cramps and endometriosis to the pain of childbirth and painful sex. At the same time, pleasure has been treated as suspect, dangerous, or indulgent. But what if pain and pleasure aren't opposites at all? What if they're intimately connected, and understanding that connection could change the way we see ourselves and our bodies? That's the radical question at the heart of Suzannah Weiss's new book, Eve's Blessing, Uncovering the Lost Pleasure Behind Female Pain. Through research, storytelling, and personal insight, Suzannah uncovers how cultural narratives from religion to medicine to sex education have shaped the way women experience both suffering and sensuality. And she offers a vision for how we can reclaim pleasure even in the places where pain lives. Today, Suzannah joins me to talk about what inspired this book, why shame has kept us from accessing our full erotic selves, and how pleasure can be a powerful act of healing and resistance. This is a conversation about bodies, liberation, and rewriting the stories we've inherited. Suzannah Weiss is a writer and psychotherapist focused on sexuality, relationships, and women's empowerment. She's the author of Subjectified, a memoir manifesto on ending objectification through playful dances with language, and Eve's Blessing, a personal, political, and spiritual story of overcoming Eve's curse by embracing pleasure where women once accepted pain. From the New York Times wedding section to Glamour's sex guides, her writing is all over the internet, with 9,000 articles published. She has edited for Teen Vogue, Vice, and Complex, and contributed to the Washington Post, New York Magazine, and more. Let's get into it. Welcome, Suzannah.
Hello, good to see you.
Good to see you too. Thanks for coming on The Reveal. I'm very excited. For those of you guys who don't know, Suzannah is a therapist and a sex educator and a writer. She's written a lot for magazines, and she has written 2 books, the latest of which is Eve's Blessing, Uncovering the Lost Pleasure Behind Female Pain. And it's out now wherever you buy the books. And it's really great. Really well written and really full of information. Any layman can pick it up and read it, and it's really fascinating. So congratulations on your new book. What inspired you to write it? What do you hope readers will take away from Eve's Blessing?
Yeah, it started off as an offshoot of my first book, Subjectified, which is more generally about women's sexual empowerment. There was a chapter that I basically took out about the orgasm gap and the perception that women's bodies are just bad at orgasming. And I so there's a whole chapter now. It transferred to Eve's Blessing of the elusive female orgasm. And I talked to my agent about it and realized there were other myths about women's bodies. Not only is our pleasurelessness normalized, but our pain is normalized. And I just reflected upon growing up and learning about having a female body and how what I learned was associated with pain. I learned I would have period cramps, painful childbirth, PMS, painful first time sex, and then not even have pleasurable sex a lot of the time. And I was just reflecting on how this shaped how I felt about myself and how my self-esteem was impacted by hearing being a woman means pain, basically. And so I wanted to write a whole book to debunk those myths. It's also inspired by my experience with chronic Lyme disease and just facing a medical system that was not friendly to women, and wanting to explore how we could change that. I interviewed many women who have overcome chronic illness and chronic pain, as well as sexual issues. And I also used their stories because I found them very inspiring, just to paint a vision of what being a woman could look like outside this view of woman as pain, which comes, I argue, in part from the curse put on Eve in the Garden of Eden. This idea that women are still being punished for Eve's sin.
Fascinating. Yeah, I found that very fascinating. Eve's curse, and also what Adam's curse happens to be, which is, and correct me if I'm wrong, which is, having to toil and bring in the food and work hard in the fields and all of that. Am I getting it right?
Yeah, and I talk about how they're related, how our current lifestyle is focused on painful toil. Our lifestyle is very work-centric, and many of us have high stress lives. We don't sleep enough. We don't focus on our well-being, and that's a societal issue, a broader societal issue that affects both men and women. It affects things like period pain, PMS, things that women have to go through because of this quote unquote curse on Adam. So I read the curses metaphorically as forecasts of what society would bring us and what we'd have to deal with that would impact our well-being, and then how we could actually surmount those curses.
Wow. Yeah. That was really powerful to read, I have to say, to think of it that way in that context. What are some of the most surprising or powerful stories you uncovered while researching the book?
Well, I interviewed some very inspiring people. One of my mentors, Josephina Bashout, is one of my favorites. She talks about overcoming pre-cervical cancer, and basically being told that there was no option but to cut out part of her cervix. And she traced the issue to childhood sexual trauma she experienced. And she utilized different holistic healing methods, and also just worked on improving her relationship to her sexuality, and gradually got better as she did that. And now she talks about the orgasmic life. There's a whole chapter of my book about that, living life orgasmically, where she just prioritizes pleasure, not just in the bedroom, but also outside of it. So just enjoying the feeling of sipping your coffee, or feeling the wind blow against you, and or the shower against you, and sort of living your life like one giant orgasm. So she was one of my favorite people to interview because of that concept. One of my other favorite people to interview was Sara, author of The Lady's Handbook for Her Mysterious Illness, who actually helped me a lot with my own health issues. She lays forth a theory in her book that women's bodies are experiencing the consequences of many modern lifestyle issues: overuse of antibiotics, over medication in general, just high stress, poor sleep, poor nutrition, overuse of technology. How like these sort of mysterious illnesses women experience are related to larger lifestyle issues. And she talks about gut health and the HPA axis and different things that we don't normally think about with our health. And her book advocates functional medicine, which is what ultimately helped me more than anything else. But yeah, I highly recommend her book because that was a very influential book for me.
Great. We'll link to it in the show notes, definitely. That's really fascinating to me. The whole book sort of frames pain and illness as intrinsic to womanhood, right? Because generally everything is focused on the male gaze or male pleasure. And that, I think you proffer through pain, we can get intimate with pleasure. Can you go into a little bit more of that?
Yeah, so I was walking a balancing act through the whole book between validating women's pain, because the truth is, in the world we live in today, painful periods are very common. Painful childbirth is almost universal. And so a lot of people have trouble believing some of what I say in the book, which is women can have orgasmic births, ecstatic births. I interviewed a lot of people who have, and positive periods and all these great experiences, but our life, like the way we live life right now, is often not set up for it. Society is not set up for it. Patriarchy is not set up for it. And I think part of the journey of leading a life of pleasure is feeling your pain. And this is something that is almost unavoidable for anybody with a chronic illness, is to really get intimate with their pain, meaning just sit with their body and just pay attention to what they're feeling. And that meant for me, just having dealt with a lot of chronic health issues, just giving myself permission not to work, giving myself permission to just like sit in the bath and cry if I need to, and mourn the life that I could have had. And I believe, and a lot of people in the space say this, that it's through learning to feel all emotions, whether it's pain or pleasure, that we actually can open greater doorways to pleasure, because we're in our bodies, we're attuned to our bodies, and we're aware of what we're feeling. And that's also what people often say about this concept of orgasmic birth or ecstatic birth. Advocates often say that it's not about leaning away from pain or being afraid of pain. That often it's about actually just learning to feel everything. And what they say is that if you breathe into the contractions and you feel the discomfort, it quickly changes, but it's by dissociating with the mind that you actually become more tense and you actually feel more pain. So there's this whole other philosophy of pain is not something to avoid, but something that you can move through if you're willing to feel it.
Yeah. Wow. That's really a powerful statement, because it's true in so many other parts of our lives too, right? Like the best way out is through. And I just recently lost my dog of 18 years. And, that pain of that, I know some people think it's just a pet, but they're your family. And I made a conscious effort to feel the pain and go through it and not work and not do anything because it was so painful. I wanted to get to the non-painful part of mourning and grieving. And it naturally happened sooner than I thought it would. And I think what you're talking about is really sort of doing the same thing, is sitting with it, sitting with the pain, noticing the pain, recognizing where it is in your body, what it's doing to you, and just feeling it, making sure that you feel through it so that you can have and allow yourself the pleasure. I really like that idea of that. Historically, women's pain has often been dismissed in favor of male pleasure or pathologized, like I mentioned before. But how does this cultural erasure tie into how women experience pleasure?
Pain during sex, which 1 in 10 women say they experience. And this is something that's often deprioritized because sex is seen as something for male pleasure. So not only is women's pain, especially during first time sex, normalized, but I also, as a sex therapist, work with women who have pain. It's not their first time and they have pain with sex and they don't know to do anything about it because they've learned, like, well, I should have sex for the sake of my partner because he needs it. And that ideal also shapes how medicine treats women's sexual issues in general. Um, I wrote a bit about certain medications that affect women's sex drive or sexual response, and that is often ignored, such as SSRI antidepressants. I went on those as a teenager and was not told at all about sexual side effects, so I didn't realize that was in part why I had trouble with orgasms in my first partnered sexual experiences. Nobody taught me about that. There are also some forms of birth control can affect certain women's sex drives or even cause pain during sex. And often this is not something that they treat immediately because they're thinking I need to be on birth control to avoid getting pregnant, which is also in part for the man's pleasure because there are things men can do. They can wear a condom. They do not have to ejaculate inside you, but often it's on the woman to use birth control, which can potentially impact their enjoyment of sex. There are many examples of this. LEAPS, a procedure that removes precancerous cells in the cervix, can cause difficulties with arousal and orgasm and sexual sensation. There are outliers, but there are some scary stories. What?
That was me. I had that
Really?
procedure and I experienced that as well. So yeah, I can attest to that. But go on.
Well, yeah, a lot of doctors don't even acknowledge that or say, this couldn't have caused that. And there's more and more women saying that they did have that experience. I'm curious what your experience with that was.
Yeah, I've had a history, a recent history of abnormal PAPs and in my uterus and my cervix. And they go in and they scrape out the bad cells that are being bad cells there. And I noticed that my journey to arousal was diminished afterwards, and it was harder to come afterwards. And I noticed it, and I didn't quite know why. And I thought, well, is this just my brain right now? Is this something physical? Because it's interesting that it's happening right after my procedure. Which is going to actually lead to a full hysterectomy, which is interesting. And then that's a whole other thing that we could get into later on if you want to, about, how easy it is for people to just say, well, we'll just get rid of your organ, and not talk to you about any sort of sexual side effects, which I know as an educator, it can happen. It's, there are people that do just fine. But I would, as a patient, like to know the risks to my pleasure, especially since, with a full hysterectomy, it's going to be the cervix as well. Because some people don't have a choice whether they get that done, but it would be nice to have our medical system make it sort of de rigueur to talk about potential sexual side effects and give resources afterwards.
Yeah. Is that something you're still dealing with or something you were able to work through?
Still dealing with it. Yeah. So I'm actually scheduled for a hysterectomy in February. So to abate cervical cancer. So, I have to get it, but, it's not immediate, but it's, I think how many other people go in there that aren't sex educators or sex coaches or whatever and don't even think about it, So.
Yeah. I know there are pelvic nerves involved in sexual response that run through the cervix. So that probably has to do with it. But then, of course, you have to weigh that against like whatever health issue you're dealing with and whether that itself would affect your sexual.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So that's interesting. And like I was saying, it's sort of this devil may care. Well, we'll just get a hysterectomy. And yet I can't think of anything like that other than the prostate that's been normalized for men. And with men, it's just kind of like, well, it's your prostate. We're going to do everything we can to save it. But you know what I mean? It's kind of a whole different attitude in it, in discussing that with a patient who have people that have prostates, Yeah. So, I don't know. I think it's a great idea to start to question that narrative. And when we go in to see our gynecologists or we're having a conversation with them about it, to always bring up sexual pleasure in every way. Because my first question was, what are the nerves you're dealing with and what are you taking out and how exactly will that affect, And even if they tell you, oh, no, it won't affect anything. I know enough now, being a woman in the medical system, I have to check that out. It's on me to check that out because I don't believe everyone. So isn't that interesting what we have to deal with as women in a patriarchal medical world, medicalized world? But
Yeah. A lot of doctors also just don't tell you very much. Like I remember getting a UTI and being told just don't have sex for the next week, when I think what they meant was no penetration. Like, it's totally fine to masturbate and whatnot, but they'll just say things, and then you have to figure it all out yourself or else follow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I have clients and I have friends who are going through pelvic floor issues, and they just had to come to the pelvic floor diagnosis themselves and realize, oh, I'm right. This is why I'm having pain when I have sex. It's my pelvic floor. Because who talks about the pelvic floor? Nobody talks about the pelvic floor, you know? So, any hoodles. I'm wondering if you could talk about how religious narratives, especially the story of Eve, shaped cultural ideas around women's bodies and suffering and sexuality, and how it's still relevant today.
Yeah, so there's this story that Eve was cursed with sorrowful childbirth. Well, there are many translations that I will multiply thy sorrow and thy conception, thou shalt give birth in sorrow. Or there's one translation that says, I will make your pains in childbearing very severe. So this is taken by many to mean that because Eve ate that apple, that women have pain in childbirth. And even if you don't believe that story, there's a widespread idea that it's normal for women to have pain in childbirth. And sometimes menstrual pain is called the curse. There's some studies. I think the latest one is from a few decades ago showing that this is still a common term to use, the curse for menstrual pain. And then some religious communities even take it to normalize painful sex, sorrow in conception. And so whether or not people actually believe in the religious idea, there is a widespread idea that these things are normal, which probably stems in part from the prevalence of the quote unquote Christian view, which I don't think is truly Christian. Just that it's normal to have pain in all these instances, that's like a fact about women's bodies. And, that there's this talking about how we got there. And then there's other things in the Bible, such as the idea of showing the sheet after the wedding night to prove that the bride was a virgin. Both of these passages, though, can be interpreted differently. I talked to one Bible scholar who said the thou shalt give birth in sorrow was more about the anxiety around having kids, around being infertile, around will you carry on your family line, around like, will a woman, stay faithful to her husband and have kids with the right person, or will she be punished? So there's all these different interpretations. I personally think it means more the latter. And even the blood on the sheets narrative, this was a very specific passage about what to do if your husband turns around and accuses you of not being a virgin. And it was understood that blood on sheets could be easily faked. So it was arguably more to give women a way to avoid like being put in jail by their own husband, basically. And so there are all these different religious ideals that kind of got misinterpreted and mistranslated over the years. And it's not just religion, it's also ideas dating back to the ancient Greeks about women basically being concave men or small men and sort of treating the female body the exact same as the male body, which has led to a lack of research specifically on women. And so all of these ideas sort of, even if we do not think of it consciously, there's this larger narrative of women are being punished. And in general, just we're all being punished. We all live under the influence of this theology of no pain, no gain. And I think that's the bigger sort of idea that's shaping how we view our bodies. Like we often feel almost like we deserve pain, or as if it's not something that we deserve to live free from. And I think for the first time, women are telling stories about things like pleasurable childbirth and, painless periods and things that we had not previously heard about. And we're finally learning there are alternatives to this narrative that you just have to live in pain. It doesn't mean that everyone can suddenly wave a magic wand and just lead lives full of pleasure, but it does mean it's not necessarily a biological inevitability forever. And we deserve whatever we can get to have more comfortable lives.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Yes, I agree, and I also agree it's not very Christian coming from a Jew. But I remember when I got my period, I was 13, and I was sitting on the toilet, and I screamed for my mother to come in. And she came in, and when she saw that I had had my period, she slapped me across the face. And in the Jewish religion, apparently that is something you do. You slap. I still to this day do not understand. I can't find it anywhere. But she like instinctively just slapped me across the face. She didn't do it really hard, but she did it. And I was so shocked. Like, what was that for? You know? And she goes, this is no, she believed that, you know, we should all, you know, that, you know, she's very liberal, and she didn't feel that it was shameful to have your period. She just did it because she was taught to do that to her children when they got their periods. And that it was some Jewish tradition. And I've since spoken to some other women, not very many, but some other women that had the same thing happen to them. So maybe it's a regional thing. I don't know. But have you ever heard of that? I haven't heard of it.
I have not heard of that. That's funny. It's almost like a BDSM thing. Like, I feel like in which BDSM, it's like punishing someone without really punishing them because she didn't do it with hostility.
No,
like, I feel like
no.
that can almost be a transmutation of these biblical ideas.
Yeah, it was so, it was done without emotion. It was just, boop, you know? And I always find that fascinating. It shocks some people when I tell them because like, who, why, what, huh? And I just remember thinking, okay, well, my family's weird. So maybe that's just part of it.
You weren't scarred from it?
I'm sorry?
You weren't scarred from it? Because she explained that it's just a custom?
No, because it was just kind of like, really? It's a Jewish thing? Really? You know, I got kicked out of Hebrew school, so I wasn't the most Jewish kid in the world. So I thought, okay, maybe I skipped that day. Who knew? Who knew?
What do you get kicked out of Hebrew school for?
For talking too much and instigating not like instigating disruption. So I didn't want to be there, and I made it very clear that I didn't want to be there. So no bat mitzvah for me. But then again, I didn't have to go to Hebrew school, so you know, that was great. I'm interested in finding out your idea on, for women who experience pain during sex, to begin exploring the possibility of pleasure instead of shutting down. What might you suggest? Do you have any advice where to start?
Well, there are different kinds of pain during sex. Definitely get evaluated by an OBGYN, and I would say, and a pelvic floor physical therapist, because there are so many different things that could cause that, like infections, like endometriosis, like pelvic floor dysfunction. But regardless of the source, you know, a lot of people still define sex as intercourse, as penetration. So if penetration is painful, there are many other ways to explore sexuality non-penetratively, obviously, oral sex, manual sex, you know, and just sensual. There are ways to be sensual with your partner without even having sex, bathing together, giving each other massages. Just don't think that a pain with sex means you cannot experience intimacy. And, yeah, and there are also different tools, you know, depending on what condition you actually have. But there's something called the O-nut that shortens the penis. You put it around the penis to make it shorter.
I love that. Yes, I'm very familiar.
Yeah. Or you could put it around a dildo, so that it doesn't go in too deep. There's, what else? The Vuvatech. So I interviewed a woman who created a magnetic dilator that reduces her pain during sex. And yeah, it's called Vuvatech, Tara Langdale Schmidt.
Okay. Vuvatech.
Sex toys and lube can help. Just vibrators can create a more efficient route to pleasure. Lube should not be a stigma if penetration is at all uncomfortable. And talk to your partner, and don't be afraid to tell them if you're at all uncomfortable, because that is also uncomfortable for them. Yeah. You know, it shouldn't be normal.
That leads me to ask you about how partners can support someone who's navigating both the pain and the search for pleasure. Like vaginismus comes to mind when you're working through vaginismus and maybe you're partnered and you still want to try, but you're still working through it. How can a partner support their partner?
They can find out whatever it is that their partner does enjoy and not feel pain at. Like with vaginismus, that's specific to penetration. So then clitoral stimulation might be pleasurable for that partner, or even breast stimulation or something outside the genitals. And engage in plenty of that, especially if you're going to attempt penetration, do lots of foreplay beforehand. And just stay in communication with your partner, check in with them. Especially if they're not used to communicating their own needs, you can check in and just say things like, are you good? Is there anything I could do to make this better? And listen to them and just, be there to support them if it brings up difficult emotions. If they even need help finding a doctor, because those things can be stressful, you can offer your help with that. And know that most of these things are treatable. And so don't give up and just believe in your partner's ability to find more pleasure on the other side of it.
Yeah. I absolutely agree. And I also think that when your partner's going through something like that, it's always good to do your own research on whatever it is that's causing the pain, so that when they're talking to you, they know they're talking to someone who has at least read about the effects on somebody, so they can feel seen and heard in that way. It can be a very difficult road to hoe when your partner is having some pain, and patience and communication, like you were talking about, and also looking for other ways to be into your partner sensually and sexually. That doesn't include whatever the painful part of sex is. How can sex education evolve to address this more nuanced understanding of the body? You had mentioned in the book, I knew about the clit not being mentioned in anatomy books until like the 90s. But I think it was 85 to 90. I think they started coming out in books, if I'm correct, at any rate. But that even in the 90s, there were only a couple of books, anatomy books, that actually discussed the blood vessels and how it's attached in ways that affect your pleasure. And now that we have a society that does offer some sex education, depending on what state you're in and what county and town, how do you think we can best evolve to get the information across, to be able to take ownership of our own bodies and be able to advocate for ourselves and go forward that way?
Yeah, well, there's a really good TED talk by Peggy Orenstein where she talks about how in sex ed, like the women or the girls learn about periods and the boys learn about erections and ejaculations, or those things are taught side by side. And that's even in international guidelines for sex ed curricula. And I just think about how erasing that is of women's pleasure, that we learn about men's pleasure alongside women's pain, basically, a pleasurable. I mean, even if not psychologically, those things for men are physically pleasurable: erections, ejaculations, wet dreams. And then we learn about periods for girls, which in reproduction and pregnancy, which is associated with pain. So I just think about how that shows us, like, directly, like women are associated with pain, men are associated with pleasure. And I think when we learn about male pleasure and orgasms, we should also learn about the clitoris and about female pleasure and orgasms. And that doesn't have to be like, it doesn't have to be taboo. It could be discussed in a clinical way. Like, this organ also leads to a similar experience to ejaculation, where there's pelvic contractions and a climax. And it does not have to be a big deal, but there's a huge stigma on women's sexuality and women's pleasure. I think because a woman who is not afraid to pursue pleasure herself is an empowered woman, and society doesn't like that. And I think in the meantime, until curricula do that, there are online sex education resources, websites like Scarletine, O School, There are also some sex educators who teach online courses for both kids and adults. Interrupt me if you can think of any. I know I wrote about this a while ago, but nothing has come to mind.
Yeah. I think, does Owl do it? Our Whole Lives? Yeah. Our Whole Lives. And then, if you are a sex educator, EDC, Everyone Deserves Sex Education is a great place to take classes or become certified as a sex educator.
For adults, there's a site called Educated. That's another one.
Be Educated? Yeah. I'm just taking notes so I can put them in the show notes. Yeah, it's pleasure positive sex education, I think, is so vital when we talk about sex education generally. And I'm wondering if the way we talk about it, like saying it's pleasure positive, it turns people off to some extent, like just maybe saying pleasure inclusive or something for the very conservative of people on school boards. I don't know. I'm always thinking about how to get these things through school boards and be able to teach an accurate curriculum without pissing off the other side. What myths about women's bodies and sexuality do you most hope this book will finally put to rest?
Yeah, one myth I talk a lot about in the book is the myth of the elusive female orgasm, which is what I call this idea that it's normal for women to orgasm less easily than men. There's a lot of research establishing an orgasm gap in the United States and many countries where men report having more orgasms than women. And there's an idea that this is natural, that women's bodies cannot orgasm as easily. However, it often relates to the way in which we define sex as primarily penetration and don't teach people about the clitoris and clitoral stimulation, and also have a male-centered view of sex where to many people still seen as primarily to please the man. There's this idea of men want sex, women want love, so women will have sex to keep the man. A lot of women disagree with this, but it still lingers. It actually is a pretty new idea. I trace this back to around the 1700s. Before then, there was this idea that women actually had to orgasm to conceive. And so clitoral stimulation was taught in marriage guidebooks and different books like that. And then people realized that this was not necessary for a woman to conceive, and that actually there were some political forces around the 1700s, 1800s that sort of caused a biological subjugation of women. The Victorian era, there was this ideal of domesticity, that women were pure, that they were there to take care of the household. And then there was, during the French Revolution, there was a feminist movement and there was backlash against it. And people like Rousseau, with my cat, wanted to paint men and women as biological opposites, to sort of paint women as purer and more geared toward the home. So in general, we had these ideas that largely come from political factors, that women's bodies are opposite of male bodies. And part of that is women not pursuing or enjoying sex as much. And there came the idea of that a woman sort of only would be sexually responsive to her husband, or even needed, one guidebook called it an erotic education from her husband to learn how to enjoy sex, just because of this emphasis of sex only within marriage. And so women were actually previously seen as very sexual beings because of the idea that Eve was lustful and curious and sin prone for eating the apple. So there are like many, many different ideas of women's sexuality floating around that are not necessarily based only in biology. And what the biology and what the scientific research says is actually women are capable of orgasming as much as men if they are in situations where their partner attends to their pleasure. Lesbians report orgasming at almost the same rate as gay men. Women can masturbate to orgasm within around 5 minutes is the median. It's not really that complicated for a woman to orgasm. And so I would really like to just get rid of that idea, because it's leading women into sex lives where they are not having as much pleasure as their partners or as much attention as their partners. And that is being seen as normal. And that, I think, really impacts how we see ourselves. I think when we see how capable of pleasure we are and discover our true capacity, we just learn to appreciate our bodies more, not for how they look, but for how they feel, and learn to be glad to be living in these bodies. And so that's my hope with my book, that women can be happier to be inside their body.
That's great. I love that explanation. In your own life, how has researching and writing this book changed the way you think about your body and your pleasure?
Yeah, some of the women I interviewed really opened my mind in terms of how much pleasure is just possible for women. I learned about orgasmic birth first around 2019, and I'd never heard of it before. This idea that women could give birth, and it doesn't necessarily mean having an orgasm during childbirth. If you talk to advocates, it's more about having pleasure during childbirth, however that's achieved. And I learned a lot from interviewing people who experience this, that it's a different mindset. It's this mindset of having the confidence in yourself to know that you can follow your own intuition during childbirth, and prioritizing your pleasure, which for some means, and this is unfortunately not financially available to everyone, but giving birth at home or at a midwife center, giving birth outside, having things like lighting candles, music, having essential oils, having your partner massage you. As a doula, I sometimes bring a massage gun to births, even if they're in a hospital. It's again just a different idea of what's possible for women. And they often talk about just leading a lifestyle that sets the foundation for that by prioritizing pleasure, spending time in nature, and learning to sit with intense emotion. Yeah, that was something very encouraging for me to learn as someone who hasn't given birth but might one day, to know that that's a possibility, and that's something you can start now, is just learning greater body awareness, body attunement, and prioritizing pleasure in your life, and learning to listen to yourself and your own intuition. Yeah. And I also talked to some women who talked about sexual experiences they'd had that I didn't know were possible. One of my mentors, Sophie Lua, talked about how she thought orgasming through intercourse was not really possible for a woman. And as she used modalities like breath work and studied Tantra and really learned how to relax and let go in the bedroom, she realized that that, in fact, was not a myth, that she actually could orgasm through intercourse, but it was again about developing a different relationship with her body. And that was something I was almost scared to say, because I don't want to shame women who cannot. But I do feel like there is a broader, I cannot necessarily give someone a technique or a sex position to say you can orgasm during intercourse, but it seems like it's about the relationship that someone develops to their body and their ability to really feel everything. That does open up new sexual pathways. And it's not that hard for me to believe, given some people can orgasm without even physical touch, just through their mind, just through visualizing, fantasizing. So I just think that a lot more is available to us if we can step outside the box and explore some of these more holistic, more woo-woo healing methods. Plant medicine is another thing that has been part of my journey and that other women I interviewed have talked about. I think that there are larger possibilities that we're not even aware of yet, because we're stuck in our modern lifestyle and have trouble getting into sort of a relaxed parasympathetic state that makes a lot of new experiences.
Yeah. I love that. And I love the talk about basically somatics. And somatics make a lot of things possible, being in touch with your body and really making a concerted effort to feel it and feel where it's coming from and feel the feelings that it brings up and where it is. And I think so many things are possible by doing that, by working through some of like you said, the woo woo part of sex. There's a reason why Tantra is so popular. There's a reason why people espouse a lot of different things, because it works for them, and to keep one's mind open enough to accept the possibility of that, I think is a really powerful and brave thing to do. So thank you. Thank you for writing this book. I think it should be definitely regular reading for sex educators, but it definitely reads like for something for the general public. So, and that's Eve's Blessing, Uncovering the Lost Pleasure Behind Female Pain by Suzannah Weiss. I encourage everyone to go get it, pick it up, read it. Will there be an audiobook?
Sadly, there isn't right now. That's really something my publisher takes care of. But if you like audiobooks, my first book, Subjectified, is available on Audible.
Perfect. Subjectified. And we, of course, will link to that in the show notes as well. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom, Suzannah. I really appreciate you coming on and sharing your insights.
Thank you. I also wanted to plug that I'm now offering psychotherapy and sex therapy. So if my ideas resonated with you, reach out. For those, I offer that in California, but those outside California, I can offer sex coaching.
Highly recommend Suzannah Weiss. So if you're interested in therapy or coaching, look her up. She'll be in the show notes. All right. Thank you again. And that will be a season finale for us at The Reveal. So see you in the spring when we come back with a whole new season of 10 episodes of The Reveal. Thank you so much, and we'll see you in the spring. Thanks for listening to The Reveal. If this episode resonated with you, I'd love for you to share it with someone who might need it too. And if you'd like to stay connected, head to ellechase.com to join the mailing list for updates, the Substack version of The Reveal, and early access to new episodes. You can also follow The Reveal wherever you get your podcasts. And if you have a moment, leaving a review helps others find the show. Email for the show can be sent to therevealmail@gmail.com. And of course, if you're on the social medias, I'm at the Elle Chase on all platforms. Until next time, stay curious and remember, the most powerful stories are the ones we dare to tell.